Aria Evans is a Toronto-based choreographer who also happens to be this week's guest on the Backstage Creative. My name is Krista Copper. This is the Backstage Creative, the podcast that focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater. I have not interviewed very many choreographers, not for lack of reaching out to them. It just hasn't worked out. I think maybe I've had 3 or 4 choreographers on the show. I love talking to dancers and choreographers because even in my personal life, I don't know many of them. It seems like dancers are always kind of in their own corner. Like at school, at the schools I went to, especially, dance was like always in a different building or like in this very separate area away from the music and theater classes, which is weird. But the dance world is a world I'm not familiar with, hardly at all. And so it was so fun to talk to Aria. It's one of the main reasons I started this podcast is because I wanted to learn and I wanted to be exposed just to different worlds within the world of art. While we all make art, I mean, it looks different, and musicians talk about art different from visual artists who talk about art in a different way than designers who talk about art in a different way than choreographers. And I love being able to listen to people talk about art in a different lens, which also helps me kind of reshape how I'm viewing art and how I approach my instrument. But yeah, this was such a good conversation. I'm so glad that Aria took the time to sit down and talk with me. If you like the Backstage Creative, I would love it if you would leave like a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts or wherever you listen. That helps other people find the show. And if you have guest suggestions, I'm always up for those. Reach out to me on Instagram or Facebook, and I would love to hear from you. Or if you don't have guests and just want to say hello during a pandemic, I always want more connection during this time. I think we could all use it. So feel free to reach out to me with just a hello as well if you feel so inclined. But let's get to it. Here's my conversation with Aria Evans. What have you been up to this last year?
I mean, personally, this year has been very tumultuous. I went through a bit of a health scare this winter. So I was in the hospital, I've been recovering. But creatively, I think the last year has really been about incubating. It's like thinking about how I want to take the work that I do forward and what things I want to leave behind. So I feel like I've been making, but I've also really been contemplating like the ethics and values of my work and like thinking about how I can gather more things to change the way that I work in the future, which is a blessing.
That's such an important part of a creative life. I mean, it's not always about producing.
Exactly. Yeah, I started a new training program, and it was the first time since my Bachelor of Fine Arts, which I finished in like 2012, I want to say. Yeah, 2012. So it's been really interesting just like diving back into skill retention and like building a pedagogy for yourself as, I don't know, I guess like in my world, we still use like emerging artists, mid-career artists, established artists, and as somebody who's like straddling between emerging and mid-career, I don't know, it's been really fun just to reimagine again like how I want to make work and what I need to make the work that I want to make that I don't have already.
Any like specific revelations or any like specific concept that you've been mulling over?
Well, I'm a choreographer first and foremost. I also like expand into other artistic disciplines. I like make dance films and I work in theater and like across performing arts disciplines, but my choreographic work has often looked at intimacy. So I started training in intimacy coordination, which the theory aspects of are really generating like very specific thoughts around how we invite people into spaces, ideas around like consent, ideas around how do we set boundaries. And I think that it's a practice that I've innately considered in my work, but I've never had like specific skills and language to articulate those for myself and for my collaborators. So I'm really thinking about like how do we cultivate consent and how do we define for ourselves what we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with. And I think like what's interesting about COVID is we're having to have conversations about what we're okay with and what we're not okay with. And I'm hopeful that that will filter into more of our creative processes and more of our performances. I think, again, as a dancer, because we're not used to using our voices in the same way that theater artists might be, as an example, that like this practice is really interesting around like how to build agency for the people that I'm working with, for myself, and yeah, I guess that's the specific skill.
Uh-huh. So I'm a musician, so I know next to nothing about choreography.
Oh, that's so fun.
I think I've interviewed maybe like 3 or 4 choreographers. I haven't had very many on the
Nice.
show, mostly because I just don't know them.
Yes. Yeah.
um, so like when you're choreographing, is there a lot of talk around like when you're working with actors or dancers for a show, is there a lot of asking like, are you comfortable with this? Is this something in your skill level? Is this too much? Like, or is it just kind of here's the routine, do it?
I mean, I think every choreographer works differently. I'm somebody that really likes to work with the people that I've invited to make with. So, as opposed to being like, this is the choreography, do it with me, I like to make the choreography with the people in the room. So, I think in that way, there are opportunities for folks to be like, oh, this doesn't feel good for my body, or like, oh, could we try this instead, or like, oh, this maybe isn't the right choice for this moment. Can we make a different choice? And again, like that's the way that I like to work, and I think it lends itself to being able to have more conversations about what we want to do and what we don't want to do. But it's not. I wouldn't say that that's common across all choreographic fields. I think like I choreograph in Western contemporary dance, and that has like a certain kind of passed down aesthetic from the training programs that I've been a part of. But yeah, so I think that like in my world, yes, there are some conversations, but I don't think that we ever have those conversations around intimacy or touch. I think that they are very much more about what you're asking somebody to do and if they're comfortable and confident doing that like physical prompt, or if they think that it fits in with the theme that you're playing with. So it's like a little bit subtly different. But do you ever compose for dance or theater, or do you mainly like, are you a live performer in like music fields?
Mostly a live performer.
Amazing.
Yeah, I love it. I miss like I've tried to do like videos and but I'm just a live performer. I need an audience. Like I don't like recording studios. Like give me the live thing. So it's
Ooh,
um but
has COVID been challenging for that? I'm like, because I miss live performance as well.
it's been really challenging. I think I haven't really gotten my bass out very much. I don't know. I need that's my motivation is
Yeah.
getting better so that I can support the other musicians in the pit or so that I can make the best experience that I can for an audience. And so it's been really hard to get my instrument out and then like I'm disconnected from that part of me and yeah, it's been a hard year.
I feel that there's something about who are you, oh, what's the word? Like who are you accountable to when there isn't something that you're necessarily making? Like I think about how we practice our craft, and because in a like normal year we're in rooms with other artists, we're working on new projects, we're performing as a part of like different companies works that there's like a drive to like keep your, well, for me it's like my body, my vessel, engaged, but it's been harder to do that over the last, I guess, like almost a year because it's like you there's no one that you're working towards for.
Mm-hmm. I like to think that I'm intrinsically motivated, and I think I am for the most part, but something about music, like I don't want to play a bass in a room by myself. Like that's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
why I'm in music.
yeah, I feel that.
hmm Have you been able to do any like dance work this last year or choreography work?
Yeah, well, right before the pandemic hit, I was about to produce a show, and that didn't happen. So we moved our rehearsals online for about a month and a half, I think is how long we were rehearsing for. But that was that was like March of 2020, and I burnt out fast. It was hard to move a process onto Zoom and work in a completely different set of parameters and have to navigate, like, as the facilitator, all of the collaborators' needs with my own needs amidst the stress of a global pandemic being proclaimed. So that that at first it felt good, like it felt like a solution to pay the artists that I had brought together, to find a way to make use of the time. And I think that when I started to realize that I was thinking about the idea of like not losing time, that's when I paused and I was just like, what is driving that desire? Like, what can you investigate about the way that you're working to change in the future? And the idea of valuing time differently and not feeling the pressure to like work towards a deadline is something that I think is lingered. But beyond that, just in terms of like survival, I definitely have done a lot of live streams. I've filmed some projects and released them that way. And that's definitely like it's felt good to be able to make something for something that it's not just self-serving, that it has like a purpose and a place to go and a way to engage with people. And I guess slowly now that the weather's getting warmer, like I live in Toronto, Ontario, so it's a cold winter. Like no one wants to be dancing outside. But now that the weather's getting warmer, I've been a part of a few like community arts projects that are activating the public spaces, like socially distanced, but movement being taken back outside, and that's it's starting to feel like there's life again. And I think spring is always an inspiring time just because the world starts to wake up in a way that I really enjoy. And it also creatively, it's like grant season, so everyone's finding out about all of the projects that they've been dreaming up. So it feels like we're coming into something else, but there, of course, is still the fear of harming people during a pandemic in a way that like isn't worth the art, if that makes sense.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we're all just kind of like bumbling around, like
Yeah.
trying different things and like kind of, no one knows what to do. And part of that is kind of comforting because no one knows what to do. But then part of
Yes.
it is just kind of like, oh, this, how do we make art? How do we serve our community without doing harm? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. Like I even consider my ego. That's like we're being forced into all of these new ways of sharing our work, and we develop our ways of working over many many years. And there's a part of me that's like these ideas don't feel fully formed for me. Like the ideas that I'm coming up with don't feel like I've invested my like life into them. So I'm really trying to think about like how do I take the time to make the work that it's for a specific audience that is considering them and is also like valuing the artists involved to have a more holistic way of working. But that's also hard inside of the pressure of we miss the work that we're used to doing, that we love to do, that
Mhm.
we feel like it matters.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I mean, everyone, no matter their industry, has been going through a lot this year and in different ways. But yeah, as artists, it's just a lot of other industries have adapted and people work from home or restaurants, do like carry out.
Yeah,
But it's just the arts have just been slammed. Like, what do we, this is our purpose, is to bring people together in one space. And it just doesn't work the same when people are writing comments in the YouTube comment section.
yeah. Yeah, and I think about, like, for me, I really love the idea of how do we come together across all of our differences. And I'm really questioning, like, what kind of a space feels like a coming together? Like, do we feel like we are gathering in community over a YouTube live stream, over a Zoom performance? Again, I'm like, the heart of what the arts is for, where is it actually being achieved? Like, in what realm is it actually being achieved, and can it be achieved online? And I've definitely, like, witnessed some really incredible, beautiful, like, spectacular offers over the past year. But yeah, it's complex, it's complicated. Do you find that you've questioned any of the ways that you work for yourself?
I think I've really been struck by how hard it is to get out my base, because I mean,
Mm,
I've just always kind of considered myself, this self-starter, and just always motivated to do things. But like now, without having an audience or performance, like I don't have any motivation. And so I think I've been
yeah.
struck just kind of a new part of myself that I didn't quite realize that I really do need in person, and I do
Mm,
really thrive off of being in a room with other musicians and having that audience energy. But yeah, I don't know, as far as process, if I've come across any like big revelation. And I think part of that is probably because I've just kind of stepped back just to let the dust settle a little bit and the air clear. And I've
yeah.
I've been pursuing like other things. Like I've been running a lot and have this big
Nice.
big long ultra marathon coming up. So yeah, I think I've taken the time to just not walk away, but step back from music for a little bit. So that's a long answer to your question, but
Yeah.
yeah, I guess the answer would probably be no.
It's interesting. Like, one of my friends once asked me, or maybe it was more of a statement, but they were just like, who are you outside of your work? And I
Yeah.
think it's interesting to think about that as artists, because our work is so intertwined into our lives, and it's so easy to feel those, like, threads and those connections. And it is true, like, this time has also asked, like, what are the other hobbies? What are the other sort of, like, I don't know, creative habits or personality traits that we have that we can nurture?
hmm I think we're all missing the part of ourselves that comes out only when we're doing
Mm,
theater.
yes.
Like I miss that person. I don't get to see her as much as I used to. I haven't seen her in over a year, and so that's part of the hardest. Like that's one of the favorite parts of my personality, is when I have a bass in my hand in the pit and performing. And so that's kind of like adds to the mourning of the whole pandemic and all the death, and is
Yeah.
also like I'm kind of mourning a loss of a friend, of a side of
Wow.
me that
Yeah.
I really like.
It's interesting. I wonder, like, inside of mourning, what it's going to feel like to be in space again. Like, I think about the industries that are still working, like film and TV are still shooting, they're still making content. And I mean, it probably feels very different, but I do wonder, like, what is it going to feel like for us when we come back into space together? And inside of the intimacy coordinator training that I'm doing, I'm also contemplating, how are different people going to feel comfort level wise when we're entering space together? How long are we going to have this idea of, like, social distancing? Like, we've become, as a society, we've now become so used to like visualizing how much space is between us. And that's something that
Mm-hmm.
like a population has never done before. So how are we going to navigate those feelings of like people coming closer than that to you in our creative bodies, like in the creative spaces that we make work? I don't know. I'm so curious how reintegration is going to look and feel as well, and what we're going to need to get back to something that will be different but will feel familiar, I'm sure.
Yeah, and there's going to be a lot of like kind of residual social anxiety for
Yes.
years to come, I think. Where do you go to for inspiration? Do you have like certain people you follow on Instagram or certain
Ooh.
dancers that you like to watch when you're kind of stuck? Where do you find inspiration for your life as a choreographer and a dancer?
I mean, that's so interesting. I think I'm inspired by our stories. Like I'm inspired by people's experiences of the world and where they've been. And like if I propose a theme, I love conversation around that theme based on our lived experiences relating to it. But if I'm feeling uninspired, I go to nature to break myself out of that. And it's not necessarily for content, but it's more just to sort of escape the tension that exists in cities. So I grew up on the west coast of Canada, and the water, the ocean is a place that always seems to refresh and cleanse and like reinvigorate me. And I've found that when I'm exhausted, when I'm struggling creatively, I seek out the ocean or a body of water or nature just to it feels like I can sort of like shake off and erase the way that a city starts to feel over time, that like fast driving sort of anonymous gritty energy. But yeah, for creative inspiration, really it's conversations, it's talking to people and sharing our experiences of an idea that I have. My work is very much centered in like social and political subject matter, and I really value multiple perspectives. So I always think like, oh, I'm just a researcher. I'm just somebody who is curious about humans. It's like I'm an anthropologist kind of. But but yeah, like talking to people is something that inspires me. I'm not a fact person, but I'm like an experience person when it comes to inspiration. Do you live in a city, or are you like by nature?
So I live in Kansas City, which is kind of
Okay,
in the center of the United States.
no ocean.
No ocean at all. No mountains. I really love the mountains, and so yeah, I'm kind of missing them a lot right now. But Kansas City is great because it's you have a big city, but then there's not a lot around it, so it's pretty easy to get out into the country. Like the countryside is maybe like 30-40 minutes away, like farmland
Nice.
and dirt roads. And so yeah, I've found myself a lot just like getting out of the city. I don't like big cities, and the only reason I live in a big city is for music, like so
Yeah,
that I can do my music career. But now that's not really happening, and so I get a lot more frustrated with big cities now that I feel like my reason for living in one is gone. So yeah, I've been escaping
yeah.
to escaping to farmland a lot lately.
I've had a lot of friends leave the city in the last year. I've had a lot of friends have children, and I've had a
Yep.
lot of friends leave this city. And it's interesting, like what you just said. The reason why we live in the places that we do is no longer happening, and like how does that again affect our quality of life? It's like that's such an interesting question. I think about that so often. I'm like, why am I in the city? Like I
hmm
should just move somewhere else. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I don't know, like again, I am inspired by the environments that I live in, and I wonder, because my work is socially and politically engaged and I do live in a big like multicultural city, I question, would my work change if I lived somewhere else? And that's always something that, I mean, I don't have an answer, but it's interesting to consider.
Mhm. Yeah, that is an interesting thing to think about. This is maybe a large question, and there may not
Yeah.
be there may not be like language for it, but how do you put some like a political or social issue in dance? What is how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I okay, well, the one of the work that I was supposed to present at the beginning of the pandemic is called Heart to Heart, and the idea for the piece was that I would put out a call to artists that I hadn't necessarily worked with before, people that were like strangers to me, that were familiar with dance that weren't necessarily dancers themselves. A lot of the folks that I did end up hiring are dancers, but not everyone is. I said, we're going to have a conversation about the state of the world. So the very first rehearsal that we had, we all sat down and I said, like, what is something that you care about in the world right now? Like, why? And let's talk about it. And I was really interested in bringing two people from like different cultures, from different forms, from different dance practices, from potentially like different lifestyles together to see where we connect across our differences. We had that conversation that I recorded, and then I brought that conversation into like a studio rehearsal because that was like in my living room over drinks. And in the studio, we played the recording and played with improvisation. And as we continued to improvise to that conversation that we had, images would come forward or ideas would come forward or like physical manifestations would reveal themselves that were like either metaphor for the conversation or images that were reflecting what somebody was talking about. And like inside of that call to artists, I said that I was interested specifically in like social and political conversations. So the work sort of formed itself around people's belief systems, but was manifested in the body through dance. And some people did speak, not everyone chose to do that. But the choreographic aspect was a reflection of those conversations. So some of the artists talked about their relationship to their body, like and society's relationship to their body, and like the size of their body. So their dance became a conversation about like how bodies get interpreted through the sort of like societal view. Other people had conversations about like, I have two children and I'm a mom, and the other person was like, I'm a gay man and I never want children. And this conversation about like how do we look at a kind of like family nucleus, or how do we respect someone's decision without necessarily wanting it for ourselves? So that, I think like every work that I make is different. Like the creative process changes to reflect the work that I'm making. It's not like a formula that I'll use every time to make a dance piece. But that was one way. One of the earlier pieces that I made was called Ranked, and it was about like how power and privilege gets reflected and represented in society. So I had 6 dancers of like different cultural backgrounds, and we played with images of like creating and dismantling power, of like pushing people down to get ahead, of like the greed that gets associated with capitalism, and like taking images from the idea of power dynamics to turn into a physical piece. So in that way, I would like bring words and ideas and concepts into the rehearsal room and we would play with manifesting them in the body through metaphor. If that makes sense. I don't know if, again, like, I know that you're a musician and sometimes we can like have a certain language that we speak in our artistic practice. So if some of that was not accessible, I can explain differently if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I a lot of times I just like to hear people from different disciplines talk because like you
Mm-hmm.
said we all have different kind of a different way to talk about art.
Yeah.
And I think it's just interesting to hear how people, some people approach it more of like a tangible or visual or oral, and so I think it's just fascinating to hear people talk, and especially since, like I said, I haven't talked to a lot of choreographers, and
Yeah.
I usually dancers usually aren't my friends for some reason. I don't know. I'm usually friends with like the sound engineer or the
Right.
music director, so it's interesting to hear a dancer talk about art in their creative process.
Yeah. I think like when I reflect back on the work that I make, it really does come down to the relationships with the collaborators. Like really interested in just like cultivating friendships and having conversations with people and being able to turn that into work. It's not about how it looks as much as it's about how do we come together. Like the process is more important to me than the product, but then of course I think about the product because we're making work for audiences. So, but yeah, there's definitely like circular links inside of that. But I just like talking to people. I just like hearing about people's stories and what inspires them, or I don't know, how they think, because we all think so differently and we all have such different experiences. And I think I'm mixed race. I have like a very complex identity, and I think that part of understanding my own identity is reflected in how I work. It's this idea of like how do we put multiple perspectives into one piece, into one idea? How do we show, again, like the intersections of all of our lives? So it's also like a healing journey in a way of just figuring out who I am in this world as well.
Hmm. I think that's one of the great things about theater is that you kind of can't help but look at art from different viewpoints because no one is operating in a bubble, and no one really has like complete authority over what is going to go on stage, and so I think that's you're kind of forced in the theater world almost to think about something from a different viewpoint, and to talk to people who have different backgrounds than you, and
Yeah.
mhm.
Do you find in music that there's opportunities for that, like because it's not necessarily a like verbal form unless you're singing, and the way that you're describing your practice, it makes me think that there's maybe like a conductor sometimes involved with you. But do you find those conversations happen in music as well?
A lot of times to me, and maybe it's just the friends I've had from school. A lot of times, music feels kind of insular. Like, we get kind of, especially. I mean, I, I pick on the classical music world a lot because I think it just has so many problems. But
Yeah.
especially musicians who are kind of steeped in that classical music world of Eurocentric,
Right.
Beethoven is the king, everything we compare everything to him, and I just sometimes I get very frustrated with kind of the singular viewpoint that can be prevalent in music.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of arrogance in the music world, and in the jazz community too, of we're making high art, and if you don't understand it, then you don't have the intelligence to understand this jazz solo that I'm creating. And I think that's why I've kind of gravitated towards the theater world, because you don't
Yeah.
kind of get as much arrogance as you do not as much like superiority complex that I find in like the classical and jazz worlds, I think.
Yeah, I think that's alive in so many different disciplines, that sense of elitism. And I like often question where does that come from, and how do we get rid of it? How do we not perpetuate it forwards? Because like I want my audience to feel included in my work. I want them to feel like they're a part of it. I want them to see themselves inside of it. And I don't think that that idea of like gatekeeping or like saying that if you don't understand it, you're just like not of a certain level of intelligence. It's like, I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me. It's so limiting.
Yeah, especially since art is a service.
Yeah.
Like that's the goal of what we're doing is to serve other people and to create community and to bring people together. Like I don't understand the view of kind of art for art's sake. Like I think it needs to have a purpose and not just some
Yeah.
intellectual heady I don't know.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you.
Do you find that attitude in the dance world? Is there kind of this only the most smartest or,
Like
well educated
prestigious. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've encountered that inside of my work because I'm not afraid to say that I make like political work. That there is this association that is less than, that is considered less than like high art or abstract art or like a piece that isn't necessarily about something critical. And again, because I don't believe that and I don't buy into it, I just sort of roll my eyes and keep pursuing what I'm doing because that's what feels good to me. And when I look at, again, like the values that I want to portray as an artist and as a creator, then I'm just going to keep working the way that I'm working. But definitely there is that perspective of elitism. I think about like opportunities and who gets those opportunities, what presenters are looking for when there are awards, like whose work is getting those awards. And I also think about that in relationship to like the forms of dance. Like our industry very much looks at like Western contemporary dance styles and like contemporary ballet and ballet styles to be of higher quality than other art forms and other dance forms specifically. And again, I don't buy into that, but I can see its effect and I can see how it's alive in our communities. And I think like part of my mandate is to just like build more opportunities for folks and for myself included in that, where we aren't prescribing to that. We're just making the work that we want to be making that um, is contrary to that opinion. But yeah, it's so present and is definitely like inside of our systems. It's inside of our educational systems. It's inside of the institutional structure. It's interesting, like because of the year that we're having in terms of equity and diversity. I think those conversations are happening and changing some of those like hierarchical structures and beliefs. Like I think universities are having some interesting conversations about what's in their curriculum, and I think that presenters are considering how do we, do better to reflect our communities and what we're showing on our in our platforms. But because our performing arts worlds have been on hold for a year and a bit, I haven't seen that work in action yet. So I'm hopeful, but I still don't know if change is actually coming.
Hmm. I was just talking to two people who have a really great podcast that's just coming out, and they were saying, it'll be interesting to see, theater. A lot of theaters put out these like very like fancy statements during like
Yeah,
the Black Lives Matter last year, and it'll be interesting to see if they follow through on those, right? Like, yeah, just how do we hold producers and theaters accountable for some of the things that they're saying on social media right now when there's money involved and when things are open.
yeah. I wrote an article at the beginning of the pandemic called A Calling In, and it was published in the Dance Current. And this idea of like calling people in as opposed to calling people out. And I think, again, like as we move forward, how do we continue to call these organizations in to, again, like do what you're saying, to you've made this statement, how is it reflected in your organization and in your programming choices? And I think there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of potential and there's a lot of like exciting desire for what is to come, but there's also like the history of feeling let down and
Mm-hmm.
that sort of like known cycle of words only going so far, especially when it comes to conversations around like race and gender and equality.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, I'm an optimist. I guess we all just have to do it in our own way. I mean, it's interesting hearing you talk about like Beethoven and then also talking about jazz because like one is a very like when I think of Beethoven, I think of like classical music, but jazz music has its roots in not a sort of like Western view. Do you think that that industry is like talking about its history, or is it something that people are like embarrassed or shying away from?
That's a great question. So I should say as a disclaimer, I don't do a ton of jazz. I've done jazz in the past,
Yep.
and done some light gigs and whatnot, but it's not currently an industry that I'm super invested in. The podcast that I listen to, there's one podcast I listen to that interviews a lot of different bass players, and some of them are in the jazz industry. And I think with jazz, oh, what I mean, this is my podcast, so I can. I'm just
Yeah.
gonna. I'm just gonna
Have
say
your
it. Yeah.
disclaimer.
I think with jazz has a really big problem with women. A lot of times women are the singers, right? Like Ella and Sarah Vaughan and
Mm-hmm.
but rarely do you see a female trombone player or a female drummer. My perception of it, and again, like if you disagree with me, someone listening, please feel free, but I think since jazz has its roots, such diverse roots, and since there's a lot of people of color and of different cultural backgrounds involved in jazz, I think jazz has kind of got complacent with inviting different people in. um, I think they've kind of thought, well, look, jazz in Kansas City, back 100 years ago was a lot of African American people. So like, we're good. We've checked the diversity, but then when you look at it, there's very few women involved in jazz. As jazz has gotten more academic and more
Mm,
into like you can get a degree in it now, and it's gotten a little more elitist and less strayed pretty far from its roots of bringing people together to make music. And so um yeah, and there's several key figures that have kind of helped that progression get where it is today. But there is a study by Maestra Music. It's
mm,
like an organization that just connects like female music directors and musicians and women involved in theater. And they put out a study about jazz, and it was saying like 92% of women feel like they're underrepresented and feel like they've been excluded from the jazz scene. And like that's a
right.
huge number.
That's
And so
a
I
big number.
yeah, so I think jazz has kind of gotten to the point where it's like, oh, we're good. We started with African American and Creole influences. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we've got the diversity thing down. We don't need to keep trying to bring people in like women.
Yeah.
But that's my view on it. But
Yeah, you said something really interesting, even just inside of like when it got brought into institutions and you can like study it in an academic way. Like, I think about that a lot in all different art forms, like how codifying something actually limits its potential to expand and grow and evolve.
hmm yeah.
And I think about that a lot. Like, having gone to university to get a degree in the thing that I now do, I think I don't think I would do that again. I don't think I would pursue a like master's in that realm. Like, maybe if it was research based, but yeah, it's interesting when you take something into institutions what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like sometimes I have to unlearn what I learned
Yeah.
in college, which is it seems weird that I would, yeah, but switching gears a little bit
Sure.
since I've been running a lot, so I think a lot I've been thinking a lot about like taking care of my body.
Yeah.
As a dancer, I mean, you guys have to be so diligent with your bodies and your health. What have you learned about taking care of your body over your years as a choreographer and dancer?
Hmm. It's interesting, like I'm going through a newer learning where I think that I've taken my body for granted for most of my career. Over the winter, I had to get surgery. I had a tumor growing on one of my ovaries, and I had to like get it removed. So my abdominal core muscles were completely cut through from like my belly button all the way down to my pubic bone.
Oh,
It was, yeah, and I was just like, okay, like this is a version of a cesarean section, basically. Feeling my abdominals like completely severed and reattaching, I noticed and recognized how much consistency matters inside of living a healthy lifestyle. And I think I've been somebody in the past who, you know, my relationship to my body fluctuates. I'm in rehearsals for a month and a half and I'm dancing every day, and then I don't dance for 2 weeks. And then I have like rehearsals spread out over a little bit of time where I'm rehearsing maybe like 3 times a week. So I'm in studios, and there's never a consistency, and I was never cross training. I was never doing anything besides the work. And like, I mean, I have my own warm up and I have my own like strengthening exercises that are attached to that. But from going through surgery and recovery, I've started to realize that having a consistent schedule and having a consistent routine is really important. And it's something that I'm only now realizing that I'm going to have to keep up forever. And I think like I looked at exercise as punishment for a really long time. It was like, you have to do this because you're not enough of this. And I was really hard on myself in that way. And I'm trying to find like joy and pleasure in taking care of your body. And like, because I experienced not trusting my body after surgery, because I had to like I couldn't sit up for like a week and a half because it was too painful. And then I had to like, for 2 months I could only walk upstairs like a few times a day, and like things were hard in a way that I'd never experienced before. And I could feel that if I needed to run, or if I needed to like fast twitch a muscle to move, to like avoid some kind of danger, like I wouldn't be able to. And I think about that now, and just like appreciating all of the things that my body can do and all of the things that I want it to be able to do for the rest of my life. And I'm looking at my relationship to my body differently. That it's like, how do I give my body what it needs for me to be able to do what I want to do? So that's new. I now like see a trainer twice a week, and I at least walk every day. And I'm finding practices that like feel good for me, that will slowly build to be a part of my routine. But it's definitely a new realization. And I think we all have different relationships to our bodies. And as dancers, like body dysmorphia is huge, and the like expectation of what your body should look like is something that needs to be completely reformed in our industry. This idea of like should look like, because every body is unique and every body needs something different. And yeah, so I think that's like a very long answer, but I am now understanding how useful routine is, and how if you look at that in a way of like you're nurturing your body, you're giving it what it needs for you to be able to do what you need to do with it, it doesn't feel punitive. Like exercise doesn't feel punitive, it actually feels like it's a celebration, and that feels really good. I'm like amazed that you're going to run a marathon. I think that's incredible. And that's hard. Like, have you always ran? Did you like build up to running?
So it's actually it's a 50K, so 31 miles is a little
Whoa.
further than a marathon. No, I haven't always been a runner. I started in college because I was so stressed out and just didn't. I needed coping skills,
Yeah.
so I started running, and I was really bad at it.
Right.
but I just kept going. Like I think with running and with music, a lot of people are like, "Oh, I'm not talented," or "Oh, I wish I could do that," and I'm like, "You can." Like,
Mm.
um you can learn to do anything. I think talent, like natural talent, is such bullshit.
Yeah. You just need to put time into it, really.
Yeah, skill, you can learn any skill if you just take sometimes it takes some people longer, but yeah, so I was training for a marathon last year that was supposed to be in April.
Okay. Whoa.
And I had done like the majority, like 80% of the training, and then they canceled it. I was just super down, and I somehow got a hold of this book about ultra marathons, and I thought, well, I could do that. And then I
Mm.
thought, oh crap, now I have to do it. But yeah, I think from running, like I mean, I'll just echo like the things that you were saying. Like I ask myself a lot, like, what does my body need?
Mm.
Like sometimes my body needs a hamburger.
Yeah.
um, I mean, not from McDonald's, but like a good quality,
Yeah.
good quality hamburger. But sometimes like it just needs some carrot sticks or a peach. Like our bodies are really smart,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes our culture just encourages us to ignore them and get the work done and the show must go on. But our I think we spend so much time ignoring our bodies, and that's why our culture is so, well, at least American culture. I can't speak for Canadian culture, but for American culture, a lot of us are just so unhealthy, and we
Yeah.
there's so much bad dieting advice, and people are so overweight. Like it's because we're so out of touch with what our bodies need. Our bodies know what they need, but
Yeah.
we're ignoring them.
Yeah, I think a lot about like diet culture and this idea that there's like one solution for the mass public,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
I know so differently. Like my body knows how big of a lie that is. And I just yeah, it's hard because it's intertwined in so many different ways, like the images that we're fed, the idea of like what success is in relationship to like body image, and again like what we eat and how much exercise we do. But I think for me it's really about like what feels good, and like it that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Like feeling good doesn't mean that it's not going to be hard, but I do want to center that idea of like, yeah, nurturing yourself. And sometimes that's a workout that pushes you beyond what you thought was possible. And sometimes, again, as you said, it's eating a good quality burger.
Yeah, like food and exercise are not rewards or punishments. Like
Yeah, exactly.
mhm.
Yeah, it's hard to detach yourself from those messages, though. Like food as a reward, ooh, that's a hard one for me. I think I still tap into that. Like, oh, you did so good, you get to have this, and it's like, you. What do you mean get to? Like, you can always.
Mhm. I even found like the more that I ran, the less I wanted ice cream and the less I
Yeah,
wanted super greasy food. Like I still eat it. Like I went out for ice cream 2 nights ago, but
yeah,
I really do, my body just doesn't crave it. I don't crave that stuff as much anymore running as much as I'm running. And I found that to be a really interesting development. Like, yeah, our bodies know what they need to work hard.
yeah. I think about like all of the documentaries that I've looked at too when it comes to like tracking sugar spikes and like how addiction happens to like certain kinds of like processed foods, and like again, like metabolism, how our metabolisms work, and like what our bodies need. It's so interesting. It's so interesting.
I think so too. The last question I ask everyone is, what advice would you give to young people? So, what advice would you give to young choreographers?
Ooh, like what did I need to hear when I was young? I'm like, I think I'm still young. What advice do I need to hear right now? I would say, like, believe in your vision and don't be afraid to find what is unique to you. That we don't need to like prescribe to peer pressure and recreate something that we think is expected of us. That like dreaming beyond what you've been taught when and like centering your own voice and your own interests is like the way that you will find the most fulfillment.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Carly Wagner.